Archival file number 433 of the Human Resources Department of the People's Commissariat of Defense records the chronology of events of the first day of military operations in the area of responsibility of the Western Special Military District. The combat log of the district headquarters for June 22, 1941 begins with an entry made at 0 hours 15 minutes. At this moment, the duty officer recorded the receipt of a coded telegram demanding that troops be brought to combat readiness. However, technical communication channels in a number of areas were already damaged by sabotage groups. The commander of the district troops, Army General Dmitry Grigorievich Pavlov, received Directive Number 1 at 0 hours 30 minutes, while in the headquarters building in the city of Minsk. At that time, the headquarters had 3 first-echelon combined arms armies, the 3rd, 4th, and 10th, distributed along a front 47 kilometers long. The total strength of the Western Front personnel was 672,000 people, with 10,343 guns and mortars. The armored vehicle park numbered 2,901 units, of which more than 80% were outdated modifications of light tanks of the BT-7 and T-26 models. Army Group Center, under the command of Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, surpassed Soviet forces in the depth of operational formation and mobility. Against the Western Front, the 4th and 9th Field Armies, as well as the 2nd and 3rd Tank Groups, were deployed, having in their composition more than 1,500 tanks and 900 aircraft of the 2nd Air Fleet. Logistical analysis shows that the depth of location of fuel and lubricants depots and artillery parks ranged from 10 to 40 kilometers from the state border, which made them vulnerable to artillery fire and capture by mobile enemy groups. At 4 hours 15 minutes on the morning of June 22, 1941, German artillery began shelling the positions of Soviet troops, employing the tactic of suppressing communication nodes. In the first 60 minutes of the invasion, wired communication between the front headquarters in Minsk and the headquarters of the 4th Army in Kobrin was completely paralyzed. Major General Alexander Andreevich Korobkov, commander of the 4th Army, found himself in a situation of informational vacuum, having 2 rifle divisions and the 14th Mechanized Corps under his command. The technical condition of 5 AK-type radio stations in communication units did not allow for maintaining a stable signal in conditions of active radio jamming. Here, the first significant discrepancy in archival documents is recorded. According to the front headquarters report, the 6th Mechanized Corps, under the command of Major General Mikhail Georgievich Kotskilevich, received the order to advance at 5 hours 30 minutes. However, in the preserved forms of the Corps divisions, the time of receiving the command is indicated as 9 hours 45 minutes. This 4-hour 15-minute delay became critical for organizing a counterattack in the Grodno area. By noon on June 22nd, the 3rd Panzer Group under Hermann Hoth had breached the defenses at the junction of the northwestern and western fronts, advancing up to 50 kilometers in the direction of Vilnius. Simultaneously, Heinz Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group forced the Western Bug River north and south of Brest, bypassing the Brest fortress. At the time of the attack, units of the 6th and 42nd Rifle Divisions, totaling about 8,000 men, were stationed in the fortress. Due to the density of fire and blocked exits, over half of the personnel were incapacitated in the first 3 hours of the battle. Enemy artillery crews used 600mm self-propelled Karl mortars, which led to the destruction of concrete casemates not designed to withstand direct hits from shells weighing over 2 tons. By 1700 hours, Pavlov's headquarters had lost control of the situation on the left flank of the Fourth Army, where the German 24th Motorized Corps was developing its offensive towards Slutsk. On June 23, 1941, the Stavka of the High Command issued Directive Number 3, demanding the encirclement and destruction of the advancing enemy groups. According to the document, the Western Front was to launch a counterattack with 2 mechanized corps and a cavalry group in the general direction of Suwałki. Analysis shows that the execution of this task was technically impossible due to the lack of air cover. The 9th Mixed Aviation Division lost 347 out of 409 aircraft on the first day of the war, with most of the equipment damaged on airfields. The density of anti-aircraft cover for Soviet airfields did not exceed 1 small-caliber gun per 4 hectares of area, which allowed the Luftwaffe to carry out precision bombing from low altitudes. The counterattack by the 6th and 11th Mechanized Corps in the Grodno area began on June 24th, but encountered a fuel shortage. Archival records of the supply service indicate the presence of 200 tons of B-70 gasoline in warehouses in Grodno. However, due to the lack of tank trucks, fuel was delivered to combat formations in barrels on ZIS-5 trucks, which reduced the refueling rate threefold. A second critical discrepancy in sources concerns the number of tanks in the 6th Mechanized Corps. Pavlov's report to Moscow on June 25th stated that the Corps had 50% of its materiel. At the same time, the Corps Chief of Staff recorded that out of 450 T-34 and KV-1 tanks on the balance sheet, no more than 70 units remained operational. The main losses were non-combat. Due to the lack of spare parts for the transmissions of new types of tanks, crews were forced to abandon vehicles when breakdowns occurred during marches. 112 such incidents were recorded on the Grodno-Slonim Road. By the end of June 25th, the German 3rd Panzer Group had occupied Volozhin, cutting communications linking Minsk with Vilnius, while the 2nd Panzer Group reached Baranovichi. The Bialystok salient, where the 10th Army and parts of the 3rd Army were located, turned into a pocket whose neck was rapidly narrowing. On June 26th, Pavlov issued an order for the withdrawal of troops to the line of fortified areas along the old state border. However, the order was belated, as German motorized divisions were already east of these positions. The logistical collapse was exacerbated by the fact that ammunition trains for the 11th Mechanized Corps were blocked at Volkovisk railway station due to the destruction of the locomotive fleet. The expenditure of 76mm shells exceeded the established limit by threefold, and resupply had not arrived since June 23rd. Disorganization escalated at the front headquarters. Major General Andrei Terentievich Grigoriev, the chief of communications, could not establish contact with the 10th Army for 48 hours. The 10th Army, under the command of Major General Konstantin Dmitrievich Golubev, essentially ceased to exist as a centralized combat unit, fragmenting into separate groups attempting to break through to the east through the forests of the Belovezhskaya Pushcha. On June 27th, advanced units of the German 12th Tank Division approached the outskirts of Minsk from the north. The city's defense was led by the headquarters of the 2nd Rifle Division, which had about 2,000 men and 15 anti-tank guns at its disposal. For every 3 kilometers of the defense front, there was only one 45mm caliber gun, which did not allow for the creation of effective fire density against Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks. On June 28th, German tank groups linked up in the Minsk area, completing the encirclement of the main forces of the Western Front. 3 combined arms armies, 11 rifle, 6 tank, and 2 motorized divisions were caught in the ring. The number of personnel incapacitated or captured, according to German data, amounted to 324,000 men, with 3,332 tanks and 1,809 guns captured. Soviet archival data for this period is fragmented, as the documents of Army headquarters were destroyed during the retreat. A critical audit of the command's decisions reveals a systemic planning error in the deployment of the 10th Army in the so-called Bialystok salient. According to the regulations of that time, a deep penetration into enemy territory without securing the flanks created the threat of a double envelopment. Pavlov, following pre-war plans approved by the General Staff, did not have the authority to independently alter the operational formation before the start of hostilities. After the aggression began, Stavka demanded counteroffensives, disregarding the actual speed of advance of Wehrmacht mechanized formations, which was 30 to 40 kilometers per day. Stavka's directives of June 22nd and 23rd were based on outdated intelligence, according to which German tank groups were significantly west of their actual coordinates. The third planning error was the absence of prepared defensive lines in the rear. The construction of new fortified areas on the western border was not completed, and the old fortified areas on the Minsk-Slutsk line were mothballed, their armament partially dismantled. On June 30, 1941, Army General Pavlov was summoned to Moscow. On the same day, a decision was made to remove him from his post. Along with him, the Front Chief of Staff, Major General Vladimir Yefimovich Klimovskych, Chief of Communications Grigoriev, and Commander of the 4th Army Korobkov were detained. Initial interrogations were conducted in the Counterintelligence Department. In the interrogation protocol of July 4th, Pavlov indicates that troop control was lost on the very first day due to the destruction of central communication nodes by aviation and saboteurs. He emphasized that the front's reserves were committed piecemeal, which led to their sequential destruction. The commander was charged under Article 58, Paragraph 1b of the Criminal Code of the RSFSR, treason to the motherland, as well as failure to perform official duties, leading to the collapse of the front. The investigation was conducted in an expedited manner. The Military Collegium of the Supreme Court of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics began considering the case on July 22, 1941. During the court session, the defendants denied charges of conspiracy and treason, admitting only to the loss of troop control. The case materials lacked evidence of direct cooperation with the enemy, however. Emphasis was placed on demonstrated cowardice and disorganization. A technical examination of the staff's actions was not carried out, and the court did not consider the role of higher leadership in approving defense plans that proved untenable. The verdict was announced the same day: the highest degree of social protection, execution by firing squad. The death sentence against Pavlov, Klimovskych, Grigoriev, and Korobkov was carried out on July 22, 1941. The property of the convicted was confiscated, and they themselves were stripped of military ranks and awards. The statistics of material and technical losses of the Western Front during the first 18 days of the war are unprecedented. 73% of personnel, 94% of the tank fleet, and 98% of the district's aviation were lost. The front line shifted eastward by 450 to 600 kilometers, reaching the approaches to Smolensk. The impact of the catastrophe on the material and technical base was critical. the largest weapons and ammunition depots in the Baranovichi and Grodno areas were lost, forcing the Stavka to transfer resources from internal districts, exposing other directions. The route of the Western Front allowed the German Army Group Center to maintain the pace of its offensive and gain operational freedom, creating conditions for the subsequent battle for Moscow. Archival analysis confirms that the paralysis of control in the first days of the war was due not only to the personal qualities of the command, but also to the technological gap in communication means. In Soviet divisions, there was one radio station for up to 400 command objects, while in German tank divisions, every combat unit was equipped with radio. This provided the enemy with a decision-making cycle twice as fast as the Soviet one. Pavlov became the first high-ranking officer to bear responsibility for the systemic miscalculations of the pre-war period. In 1957, the verdict against all executed generals was overturned due to the absence of corpus delicti, and they were posthumously rehabilitated. However, in official historiography, the version of criminal negligence, concealing the structural flaws of the 1941 mobilization plan, long dominated. A detailed reconstruction of events in the 4th Army sector in the Brest area indicates that Korobkov attempted to organize a defense along the Shara River line, but did not receive support from tank formations, which by that time had exhausted their motor resource. The average mileage of T-26 tanks before overhaul was 800 kilometers, and the marches of the first days of the war forced the equipment to cover 150 kilometers per day over rough terrain, leading to mass engine failures. Engine losses of the GA-750 type, due to technical reasons in the 7th Mechanized Corps, amounted to 40 units in 2 days. These data were not considered by the court, which interpreted the loss of tanks as deliberate abandonment of equipment to the enemy. The situation in the Minsk area on June 27th was characterized by the complete absence of heavy weaponry among the defenders. The 64th Rifle Division, deployed to positions in the Minsk fortified region, possessed only light small arms and a limited supply of RPG-40 anti-tank grenades. The density of fire on the main axis of attack of the enemy's 3rd Panzer Group was less than 1 shot per minute per tank, which rendered the defense of fixed pillboxes largely ineffective. After breaking through the fortifications, German units employed a pincer tactic, isolating individual strongpoints. The city of Minsk was finally abandoned on the evening of June 28th. From this moment, the Western Front as an organized force temporarily ceased to function, and its remnants were incorporated into the newly forming 2nd Strategic Echelon. The final report of the Pokrovsky Commission, compiled in the post-war period, indicates that Pavlov made a number of tactical errors, particularly failing to ensure the timely withdrawal of troops from the Bialystok salient, which led to their encirclement. However, the report emphasizes that given the existing supply norms and communication speed, executing a retreat maneuver of such magnitude under continuous air attack was practically impossible. The execution of Pavlov and his staff aimed to curb panic among the senior command and demonstrate the Stavka's strict control. But in the short term, this led to an even greater deficit of initiative among the general staff in critical situations of July and August 1941. Ammunition supply for the Western Front between June 22nd and 30th was at 8% of the estimated requirement. According to the Artillery Supply Service, only 3 trainloads of 122mm and 152mm shells arrived at warehouses in the Vyazma area, whereas the requirement was 40 trainloads. This logistical catastrophe was a consequence of the destruction of railroad infrastructure. The Baronovichi, Lida, and Luninets junctions were subjected to massive bombardments, as a result of which the railway capacity decreased from 30 pairs of trains to 2 per day. Under such conditions, any operational redeployment of troops became an impossible task. Documents of the 14th Mechanized Corps record that by June 25th, personnel were feeding exclusively on local resources due to the destruction of field kitchens and food depots. The moral and psychological state of units in encirclement is characterized as consistently severe, although mass desertion was not recorded in the first 5 days. Most units continued to fight until their ammunition was completely exhausted. Losses among company battalion-level command staff in the 10th Army reached 65% by the end of the first week of the war. These individuals fulfilled their duties according to their oath, becoming hostages to a strategic miscalculation made during the planning of troop deployment in the border districts. Summing up the material and technical analysis of the Belostok-Minsk battle, it should be noted that the defeat of the Western Front was predetermined by the inability of the command system to adapt to the methods of mobile warfare employed by the Wehrmacht. The depth of the operational breakthroughs of German tank groups exceeded the response speed of Soviet headquarters by 3 to 4 times. Dmitry Pavlov, being a specialist in tank forces, recognized the potential of the enemy's armored formations, but was constrained by the framework of a defensive doctrine that did not envisage a deep retreat. His fate became a reflection of the structural crisis of the Red Army in 1941, when technical superiority in the number of tanks and aircraft could not be realized due to the lack of modern communication infrastructure, supply, and operational flexibility of the leadership. The execution of the death sentence against the front command on July 22, 1941, did not solve the problems of command, but solidified the practice of finding culprits among the executors in the face of strategic defeats. The subsequent rehabilitation confirmed the absence of personal guilt on Pavlov's part in the form of treason, but the scale of the catastrophe near Minsk remained in history as one of the most severe lessons for military science. The change of borders and the loss of significant territories of Belarus in the first month of the war inflicted irreparable damage on the industrial and human potential of the country, forcing a transition to a protracted war of attrition. The statistics of equipment losses in this battle are equivalent to the annual production volume of all tank factories of the Union of that period, which underscores the depth of the material failure of the first weeks of the conflict. In the archival funds of the Ministry of Defense, work is still ongoing to clarify the lists of personnel missing in the Belostok and Minsk pockets. Many units are listed in documents as departed in an unknown direction, which indicates a complete breakdown of the accounting and reporting system in conditions of operational encirclement. The physical condition of archival documents of that time, often scattered sheets with pencil marks, conveys the atmosphere of paralysis in staff work. General Pavlov, taking command on the night of June 22nd, entered battle under conditions where the system had already begun its movement towards collapse, and his attempts to rectify the situation with methods of cavalry attacks or scattered tank strikes were doomed to technical failure against the enemy's well-oiled machine of combined arms interaction. Currently, the historical assessment of the events of June 1941 on the Western Front is based on the recognition of a complex of factors, from technological backwardness in command and control means to the strategic short-sightedness of the highest political leadership. Pavlov and his staff became an instrument through which an attempt was made to shift responsibility for the failure of the border battle concept onto specific executors. The study of logistics and operational reports of that period allows for a highly accurate reconstruction of the mechanics of the front's demise, excluding emotional and political overlays of later eras. The facts indicate that, given the available level of communication equipment and the density of German tank wedges, holding the borderline was a technically unattainable goal for any grouping in static defense. Additional analysis of the road network condition shows that the bridges over the Neman and Shkara rivers were not prepared for demolition as planned. The Journal of the District's engineering troops indicates that explosives for these purposes were distributed only by 8 o'clock in the morning of June 22nd, when advanced enemy detachments had already seized key crossings. This is another example of the discrepancy between border protection plans and the actual capabilities of the engineering services. As a result, German tank columns did not slow their pace, overcoming water obstacles on the move, which allowed them to complete the encirclement of Minsk 2 days earlier than predicted by the Soviet General Staff in the worst-case scenarios. The total volume of weaponry rendered inoperable in the Western Front by July 4, 1941, is estimated at 480,000 units of small arms. This quantity would have been sufficient to arm 40 new rifle divisions. The loss of such a massive amount of material resources in such a short time became a critical factor that determined the shortage of weaponry in the Battle of Moscow. General Pavlov, in his last testimony, noted that the army was left without hands, referring to the loss of artillery and traction means. For every 100 guns in the district, there were only 65 tractor tugs, which rendered the artillery immobile during retreat. Almost all heavy artillery of the RGK deployed in the border zone was abandoned in positions due to the impossibility of evacuation. Thus, the reconstruction of the events of the Bialystok-Minsk battle demonstrates a fatal combination of organizational miscalculations and the technical superiority of the attacking side. Pavlov's trial was an act of political expediency, designed to conceal the scale of the systemic crisis. The liquidation of the front command could not change the trajectory of the war in its initial stage, but it created a precedent where operational leaders paid for strategic planning errors. The stark outcome of those days, hundreds of thousands of human lives ended in encirclements, and a completely redrawn map of the Eastern European theater of operations, where the Wehrmacht gained strategic initiative for many months to come. The study of these events continues, revealing new details in supply registers and loss reports, which, with each decade, make the picture of the 1941 catastrophe more accurate and devoid of ideological distortions. In the archival case on rehabilitation number 812, it is emphasized that Pavlov's actions did not contain an intent to undermine the country's defense capability. His decisions were dictated by a situation in which the speed of information receipt lagged behind the speed of changes on the front by 24 to 48 hours. In modern warfare, such a delay is equivalent to defeat. Pavlov tried to manage troops using World War I methods in the era of blitzkrieg, and this inconsistency became his personal and professional tragedy. His execution became the final point in the history of the Western Front of the First Formation, which effectively ceased to exist in the forests near Minsk, leaving behind only broken equipment and endless lists of losses that filled archives for decades to come. Technical precision demands mentioning the state of reserves. By June 25th, out of the 13 reserve divisions of the front, only 2 were combat ready. The rest were either scattered on marches by aviation or lacked a full complement of weaponry. The 2nd Rifle Division, for instance, arrived at positions near Minsk with 5 cartridges per rifle. This supply status completely precluded the possibility of prolonged defense of the city. The commander of the 4th Army, Korobkov, in turn, reported that his units were retreating in disarray due to the absence of liaison officers capable of coordinating column movements. His execution, alongside Pavlov's, underscores that the Stavka made no distinction between a front commander and an army commander concerning responsibility for the general collapse of the defense. Concluding this study, it must be acknowledged that the Bialystok-Minsk battle became a proving ground where the entire pre-war Soviet military doctrine was tested for resilience. It failed to withstand the clash with the reality of mechanized warfare. The demise of the Western Front and the subsequent execution of its leadership is a documented fact of the transition from illusions about war on foreign territory with little bloodshed to the brutal reality of total confrontation, where the price of planning errors was measured in entire armies and the destinies of their commanders. The totality of documents, from district staff orders to execution commission protocols, forms a single chain of events in which technical failures and human factors intertwined into one of the most massive military catastrophes of the 20th century. A statistical analysis of ammunition expenditure in the first days of the invasion shows that the highest density of fire was recorded in the 10th Army's sector near Bialystok. However, due to a lack of coordination with aviation, artillery fired indiscriminately, failing to suppress specific enemy firing points. The effectiveness of Soviet artillery during that period was reduced by the absence of forward observers with radio stations in the infantry's combat formations. This led to a situation where, despite enormous shell consumption, German equipment losses remained within acceptable limits, not impeding the Wehrmacht's operational plans. This aspect was also ignored by the investigation into Pavlov's case, which focused exclusively on organizational failures rather than the technical imperfection of interbranch cooperation. In the final analysis, it should be noted that the logistical base of the Western Front was practically annihilated by early July 1941. Restoring combat capability in this sector required drawing resources from deep within the rear, which slowed down the deployment of troops in other areas. Pavlov, who became the scapegoat in the official version of events, was, in reality, only one element of a system that was unprepared for challenges of such magnitude. His death did not change the situation at the front, but became a symbol of the regime's brutality and determination to hold power at any cost, even by eliminating its own senior officers at a time of acute shortage of qualified personnel. This chronicle, based on figures and documents, closes the question of incompetence or treason, shifting the discussion to the analysis of systemic errors and technical superiority in troop command.